Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Mirror. As discussed in our last episode, we're a podcast dedicated to deep diving on understanding BDD and how it affects the people around us. I'm Yen, this is Emery Brielle, and today Elaine and Vienna could not make it, but we have Miss Walsh here as our special guest. And we chose Miss Walsh due to her true expertise in the field as our consultant. She's our very own psychology education teacher and cannot wait to hear from her. Please say hello and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Miss Walsh. I've been a teacher for 17 years now and teach primarily psychology, and I'm happy to be here.
And you want to go?
Do you have any experience relating to BDD?
Other than a shattered self-esteem because of growing up and not being tiny and petite.
Yeah,
sure.
You could say that, or just any experience, like maybe you had a friend.
I think being around teenagers, I definitely can see. I mean, I remember the pressure when I was in high school, but being out of that now, but then seeing teenagers existing in just such a high pressure environment with social media and everything else, I definitely see those pressures for you guys just as a teacher.
Has it changed from how you were in high school back then to now? Because social media is such a big thing now.
Yes.
Has it changed?
Yeah, I think that I also, having a teenage daughter, I think that I see, not only because of my students, but also because of her, just you guys are, there's so much selfie taking and recording yourself in a way that none of that existed for us. And so you are so, hypercritical of these things that I don't even know that we knew those were flaws back when I was in high school. And now the things that you guys kind of pick out as flaws are even more, numerous, but also more extreme. Yeah, the pressure is definitely there, I think, in a worse way for this generation.
So thank you so much for joining us. So let's just go with what is BDD? What is body dysmorphia? What sets it aside from just a negative body image or being dissatisfied with a certain feature?
So when someone is suffering from symptoms of body dysmorphia, it really doesn't matter what their actual appearance is. What they see when they look in the mirror is a distorted self-image. And so no amount of change or exercise or weight gain or muscle gain or any of those things has a really big impact on how they perceive themselves. They still perceive themselves. Someone could lose a certain amount of weight, but when they look in the mirror, they still see the version of themselves that they were before they lost weight. And it's really hard to adjust their perception of themselves to reality if their brain is telling them that these things are not true, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's really eye-opening, especially because for someone who doesn't experience that, they kind of don't understand why they see themselves like that and why for certain people when they look in the mirror they don't see a difference. From an outside perspective, you can see someone and be like, oh, you lost a lot of weight, but they still look in the mirror and feel like they look the exact same.
Yeah. And sometimes I think it can also be perceived by others as them being dramatic or looking for attention or looking for compliments.
Yeah.
But in reality, what they see in the mirror is completely different than what reality is.
Absolutely. Can you expand a little bit on what you've seen or what you understand causes BDD? Do you think it's something that people are just born with and it's something that naturally happens, or do you think it's something more involving the environment? Do you think it's if your parents raised you a certain way, you are more self-critical?
I think that both play a role. I think that genetics plays a role in terms of the likelihood of exhibiting those behaviors, but I think there's also environmental factors that are involved as well. Like you mentioned, the idea that if someone has grown up in an environment where their image is, it doesn't even necessarily have to be critical, it can just be a topic of conversation, then they're going to be more sensitive to those. And then the other extreme side of that is if those conversations are critical, then there's even a higher chance that so much of their self-worth is going to be tied to their physical appearance that kind of is the perfect breeding ground for them to doubt what they're seeing when they look in the mirror, because they have such a fragile sense of self that's so tied to those aesthetic things that do change as you age and mature, and those things are not going to be constant. And if all of your self-worth is tied up in that, it's going to be an even greater risk of you having those kinds of reactions to yourself. But I think it's both. It's nature and nurture. It's always both.
And with us talking about BDD, it also ties in a little bit with people having anxiety or like sometimes depression, which like it makes sense, because people who struggle with like BDD, they feel isolated, like they can't talk to anyone, and that could be because of the environment they came from like their family, and like they just can't seem to speak out. Like we said in our last video, we said about like how us three were raised in a very cultural household, and it isn't easy to talk about that. But for any of like our listeners like listening to us, like what do you recommend as like a first step for like them to reach out? Like if they're like afraid, should they go to like professional help, like a friend, a family, a teacher, like someone like yourself? Because I know a lot of the students here really like you, and like they come to you for like help a lot. So like what would you think?
Yeah, I think that a really good like low risk first step can always be talking to someone that maybe has knowledge about issues just with that age group. Like for our example, in a high school, people that are familiar with the pressures that adolescents are under. Of someone like me, a trusted adult, I think is always a good idea. I think that a lot of times people in that situation may not feel comfortable if their home setting is a little more either for cultural reasons or just because of just pressure for whatever reason. They may feel more comfortable coming to an adult that is aside from their parents. I think if you can go to your parents, I think that that's a really great place to start. If that is kind of part of the problem, then I think any trusted adult is a good first step. Obviously, the best person to go to is going to be a trained professional, which, as trained as I am in education and psychology, I'm not a mental health, professional. I think that a social worker or therapist of some kind, I think is the best, but that isn't always the most accessible. And so I think that any trusted source where you can share your feelings, that's a really big first step, a really important first step. And then I think your peer group too. I think that bringing these up to your peer group, a lot of times people feel like they're going to get judgment from their peers. But in reality, if you preface it by saying this is something that's really bothering me and I'm struggling, I think most people, if they are your friends, they're going to listen and to help you. And I think that all of that is kind of the best approach, is to, be open about it where you feel comfortable, which it can be a really hard thing, especially if you've grown up in a completely different culture that you just need to be thicker skinned, because this is how we, share affection. This is how we use nicknames. Our nicknames are about physical appearance, whatever. Sometimes it makes you feel like you're being too sensitive, and you're not being too sensitive if something bothers you. You should feel comfortable talking about it. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for the elaboration on the types of treatments. We want to talk a little bit more about stigmas. So it's our mission to help others have a safe space for understanding mental health. How can we, like as a society, be better supporters of those affected by BDD or body image concerns? And like, what can we do to educate ourselves?
I think that the awareness is a really big part of it, like being aware that this is a problem. I also think there's been more of a movement towards talking about, the way that the things that we see on social media are not real. They're either really flattering angles or they are outright fake images, face-tuned images, whatever. And I think that the pressure that you guys are under to face-tune your images or to get that good angle that is part of it. Being willing to talk about that and to challenge that narrative of that we always have to look our best, whatever that is. I also think that one of the things that we don't talk about often enough is how this affects males as well. That we are really familiar as women that the pressure to look a certain way. But I think men have it too. And the social media just makes it worse. So it already exists. And then social media magnifies it even more. And I think that apps like Facetune and whatever, Photoshop, all of those things, I think that that's part of the conversation. I think that kind of understanding why we feel like we need to have these perfect images of ourselves is another part of it. I'm not sure that we're going to like overthrow the beauty industry or anything like that. But I think having a more realistic expectation that like bodies look different, not only at different stages of your life, but different bodies, different people look different ways. And that's like, we don't all need to look the same way, and that's okay. And your weight or your build is not necessarily indicative of your health. I think that all of those are really important attitudes to continue talking about. I think that we're moving in the right direction, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done with kind of dispelling those notions that we have to look perfect all the time. Our skin has to be perfect. Our body has to be perfect. We have to not age. Like all of these things are not realistic. And so challenging that, I think, kind of starts at a really micro level. And then hopefully it becomes better, you know.
I completely agree, since social media likes to make things like black and white, to where like it's either you meet the standard, you don't meet the standard, and so it's just like this constant pressure with that. But to wrap today's episode, do you have any words for anyone listening who could be struggling right now and hasn't taken that first step?
Yeah, I think that the best thing to do is definitely to reach out to the people around you, and if you're struggling, to talk to someone is the most important thing. You're not alone. You're not the only person who feels that way. A lot of times this can be a really isolating feeling, and you feel like everyone else has their stuff together and you're the only one who doesn't, and no one has their stuff together. Everyone has different things that they're struggling with. And so I think that knowing that can be helpful, but also talking to people you trust about how you feel is really important, and is going to make you feel less isolated. And then also accepting the fact that like our bodies change and we need to learn how to make peace with that. I mean, that's at 43, that is still something that exists in my world. And that, you know, is, we all have work we could do to make it better, and to also be mindful about the way we talk about other people's bodies too, you know, not just our own. Because even if we are not the target of the person we're talking about, just being around that makes us a little more self-critical. So I think that we can all be kind of careful about what we say and be more mindful about the things that we say about ourselves, but also about other people, to try to kind of help at this level. And then hopefully it kind of, you know, multiplies.
Absolutely. I think something that really struck with me that you just talked about was talking about it, because when we talked in our last podcast episode, opening up and talking about it with each other really like solidified the fact that no one is really alone in what they struggle with. Maybe we have different ways that it got brought up, or maybe different cultures, but we all kind of went through something similar, and it's nice to hear that other people understand it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I think we all learned a lot about BDD, and not only that, but some of the experiences that other people go through and how it's possible to make the world a better place, even though it seems so hard when we have stuff working against us.
Well, so our listeners listening, or anyone, if you know someone who is struggling with BDD, please reach out to a trusted adult or a mental health professional, or you can also call 855-915-0213.
Please make sure to follow us on our platforms for updates, more resources, and upcoming episodes. This podcast is all about raising awareness and keeping a safe space to remember. So remember, it's okay to ask for help.
Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you have any questions for us or for Mrs. Walsh, future ideas or topics, please send them our way. Bye, guys.